America, considered to be one of the greatest countries in the world, land of the free. So, why is it that we represent 4.5% of the world's population but house 22% of the world's prisoners? Why do we outrank all other nations in the total number of prisoners and in our incarceration rate? Why are there 2.3 million Americans currently sitting in jails, detention centers, and federal prisons? Many attribute mass incarceration with the drug war. A quick timeline. In 1971, President Richard Nixon announced, "America's public enemy number one is drug abuse," thus officially starting the war on drugs. The 1970s bring general anti-drug sentiment in the U.S., with Nancy Reagan's highly publicized Just Say No campaign taking the country by storm, and the DARE program becoming required in all public schools. Reagan's 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act enforced a mandatory minimum 5-year sentence for 5 grams of crack versus 500 grams of cocaine, a disparity that wasn't corrected until Obama's 2010 Fair Sentencing Act. And in 1994, Clinton's infamous crime bill, formerly known as the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, created the 3 strikes mandatory life sentence, offered $9.7 billion in prison funding, and hired 100,000 new police officers. All of this contributed to a 500% increase in America's prison population in the past 40 years. Mass incarceration affects people of color, specifically Black men, more than any other group in America. Though people of color make up only 37% of the U.S. population, they make up 67% of the prison population. Black men are 6 times as likely to be incarcerated than white men and have a 1 in 3 chance of being imprisoned at some point in their lifetime, even though Black people and white people use drugs at the same rate. To start my research, I first read a book entitled The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander, and watched a Netflix original documentary called 13th. Both gave me excellent background information and were a great starting point for me to launch my project. I then wrote a 10-page research paper revolving around the history of the drug war, how it disproportionately affects people of color, and what steps the United States should take to alleviate this problem. From these initial findings, I developed my thesis. To reduce mass incarceration, America must reform its criminal justice system by eliminating harsh sentencing laws and considering sending drug offenders to rehabilitation centers rather than prison. On December 7th, I interviewed Mr. Tony Lewis Jr., who explained that recreational drug use took a spike in the 1960s due to the Civil Rights Movement and Vietnam War. Uprisings broke out in poor Black communities as they fought for change in the social and political climate in America. Drugs were used as a way to rebel against the system. Mr. Lewis suggested that the government knew laws like these would disproportionately affect people of color, just not to the extent that it has. Citizens and politicians were so crippled with fear of violent crime that they saw these laws as the only solution. On December 17th, I interviewed Mr. Marcus Bullock, a formerly incarcerated entrepreneur and advocate for prison reform. My conversation with Mr. Bullock was captivating, as he was able to give me first-hand experience on what life is like in an American prison. After giving me a few personal anecdotes, we jumped on the topic of rehabilitation. Mr. Bullock agreed that punishment shouldn't be the goal of imprisonment, but rather healing and learning. Every prison needs effective drug addiction and mental health services. Without taking this step, America will continue to have a high recidivism rate and mass incarceration will continue. For my experiential aspect, I visited Miss Worthy's G Block Human Geography class and gave a mini lesson on mass incarceration in America. Since the freshmen read the book Dear Martin earlier this year, a book about police brutality and racial injustice, they are able to make textual connections to this issue. Now for the solutions, starting with our government. We must hold the new Biden-Harris administration accountable in first, eliminating mandatory minimums and other damaging, prejudiced drug laws. 2, we must fight for the release of prisoners serving lengthy or life sentences for drug possession. And thirdly, we must transform prisons into centers for rehabilitation rather than punishment and holding centers. The biggest way we can combat mass incarceration? Spread awareness. Word of mouth is the best way to educate and inform. Create healthy dialogue with family, friends, teachers, and peers. Other ways: sign petitions. Educate yourself and others. Write to your congressmen and women. Donate to organizations. Flickshop, founded by my interview Mr. Bullock, allows families to send custom postcards to incarcerated loved ones. Foundations like the Equal Justice Initiative and Innocence Project work to create criminal justice equity, advocate for prison reform, and release the falsely accused. I'd like to give a special thank you to everyone who made this project possible. Ms. Worthy, my faculty mentor who supported me all year long. My two interviewees, Mr. Lewis and Mr. Bullock, who took time out of their day to educate me on their life's work. And Dr. Amine, teacher of the Humanities Capstone, who has worked tirelessly to help all of us be the most successful we can be. Thank you, and of course, thank you to all that are listening.